Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite groups of people ever in the history of the world, and it's a group of people called the Mongols. And in the 1200s AD, they are going to create the largest empire in the history of the world. Not the most powerful, not the most influential, but the largest empire in the history of the world as far as landmass is concerned. Now, we don't start talking about the Mongols unless we start talking about their great leader, a guy named Genghis Khan, the universal emperor. And like I said, starting in northwest China, will create the largest empire ever in the history of the world. The Mongol Empire stretched about 12 million square miles. And to put that in perspective, the last great, huge empire that we talked about was Alexander the Great's empire, as far as land was concerned. Remember, Alexander's empire was 1.5 million square miles, okay? 12 million square miles, and you can see how this worked out. Now, we start talking about the Mongols, we start talking about Genghis Khan, probably the most influential, most powerful tribal leader of all time, the Great Khan. Now, one thing that he did differently than the Romans and then Alexander the Great, he broke his empire into 4 different parts, all right? Not 2, all right? Didn't just leave it to be ruled by itself. Broke it into 4 parts and then put his family members in charge of those 4 parts. If you're looking closely at the map, looking closely at the diagram, you can see the colors of those areas. You can see the extent of the empire. You can see the direction that they went. And then you can see definitely who was in charge of that empire, all right? Family members, whether it was nephews or things like that. Now, to create the empire, he had a center of the city was in Mongolia. It was called Karakorum. And Karakorum was a city that you probably already labeled on your map. They're going to ride south, and they're going to go to a place called Beijing. And they're going to have an influence on China, and they're going to have a relationship with China. And they're going to change the Mongol Empire's capital of Beijing. They're going to change the name, and they're going to call it Khanbalik. So at one point, the great thriving capital of China was under Mongol influence, and the Mongols actually changed the name of Beijing for a while to Khanbalik. Now, China and Korea was put under control of Kublai Khan. It was a great relative just under Genghis that was in history thought to be as good of a ruler and maybe a better overall ruler than Genghis Khan was. Since China and Korea was closest to Mongolia, he had to have a lot of trust. He had to have a lot of faith in the leader there, and that's why he's going to put that area of the empire under Kublai Khan's rule. Now, they're going to continue to ride west. They're going to conquer Persia. They're going to conquer Asia, basically conquer a lot of the early civilizations that we've talked about so far in this class. Russia is going to fall, Poland, and they're going to get all the way west to Hungary. All right, so they're knocking on the doorsteps of Eastern Europe, which was put under a relative called Batu Khan. Now, as you can see, as the Mongols were riding to the west, this is right about the time when the Crusades were happening. And it's interesting that some of the Crusaders actually are going to fight with the Mongols. It's interesting how the Crusaders are going to ride to the east, going over to the Holy Land, looking to get to the Holy Land, and then they're actually going to come into contact with the Crusaders as they're moving east. Now, the Europeans actually called the Mongols the Golden Horde, and the reason why they called them that is because when the Mongols were riding from the east, we're going to see in a second a caravan of Mongols, and they had tents that were made out of golden silk, golden sheen material. And when the sun in the morning would rain down upon the Mongol horde, which we call them, the sun would beam down on this yellow material, and then rays of light would go up into the sky. So the Europeans often call them the Golden Horde because in the morning time, you knew the Mongols were coming because you could see the golden light blast up back up into the sky, all right, the Golden Horde. Now, if you're looking at this diagram, you can see there's tons of animals, all right, horses, cows, and you can even see camels here. There's an example of that yellow tent. Now, the Mongols would take their homes with them, all right? So as you're looking closely at this diagram, you can see that there's a lot of tents, there's a lot of huts. Those huts and those tents are the actual homes they would put on carts and bring with them, all right? This was their homes that they would live in Mongolia. They would bring their homes with them, okay? You can see a flag there, and you can see a wolf, which was a representative animal, a symbol of the Mongols, okay? And you can see that golden sheen, the golden tent there that I was talking about a second ago. Now, and you can get a good idea of how many people were there. Now, what sets them apart was their war tactics. Now, they would have 130,000 cavalry troops at once, okay? Only cavalry in the Mongol army. So it was said that when you were born, you learned how to ride a horse. And it was also said that it was your mom's job. Mongolian women trained their sons how to ride a horse when they were like 1, 2, 3 years old. They were basically born on a horse. And then when they would go to an area, they would send about 30,000 of these troops at once to a certain area. Now, the Mongols would ride long distances, all right? 90 miles in a car is about an hour and a half, okay? Imagine how far that would be on a horse. It's a long ways. If you've ever ridden a horse before, riding 90 miles a day is a big deal. And the reason why they could do that is because they took extra horses with them, all right? So when women get tired, they would dismount and they would get on a fresh horse and then ride 90 miles a day. That's like in a car driving from here to Fort Pierce, Florida, at a couple of the turnpike rest stops up the way. That would be the equivalent of that. Now, saddles with stirrups, okay? So this image tells you and shows you that they were using stirrups. It would allow for Mongolian warriors to have a 360-degree view on the battlefield, all right? This is a great image that I have here that shows you a Mongolian archer being able to turn all the way around and fire arrows behind him as his foot are in the stirrups within the saddle, which allowed for him to be very, very efficient in warfare. Now, on top of that, these guys had siege tactics that they had from the Chinese, all right? So they had catapults, they had giant crossbows that were like 6 feet wide, all right? They would shoot an arrow that was about 4 feet long, okay? You did not want to get hit by those, and you can see those there in the top right image of a Mongolian typical crossbow there. They actually would take bamboo, and they would put gunpowder that they got from the Chinese. They would light it, attach it to a longbow, and fire that. They were literally shooting rockets from a longbow, okay? So on top of that, they were pretty scary. So they're starting to get a reputation to be a very, very fierce fighting force, to go along with siege tactics that they had to get into these walled-in enclosures and so on. Now, it was also said that they had silk armor, so you can see an example of what a Mongolian would look like. Their armor was made of like tusks and stuff like that, but under they would wear silk shirts. And they basically would take this silk and it would be comfortable for them. However, it was said that when an arrow would penetrate the armor and penetrate a Mongolian's body, they would take the silk and peel it away. In fact, the arrow would be able to come out of their body. So it was said that when the Mongolians were fighting in battle, when they got shot with arrows, they were able to take the arrows out of their body and continue to fight. So this aura of invincibility of the Mongols, basically their reputation is going to be enhanced by all these stories that pretty much were all true about what the Mongolians were doing to people that they conquered. Now, one major difference here between the Mongols and a great relationship as history is between the Chinese and the Mongols. So number one, they had to communicate, which they didn't speak the same language, okay? Now the Mongols were warriors, where more or less the Chinese were very cultured people and very clean people. Now, a second ago, I told you about that silk. Basically, the silk shirts that the Mongols would wear would literally rot off their bodies. And the reason why they would rot off their bodies is because the Mongols didn't bathe. It was said that the Mongols, you could smell them from a mile away. They smelled so bad. And sometimes they are in areas across the Gobi Desert where they didn't have water. If they did bathe, they might have bathed, and it was said that they bathed in the urine of their animals. So they literally bathed in urine, which would add to the stink, and that silk that I told you about would literally eventually rot off their bodies. There was an interesting relationship between Mongol women as far as hygiene was concerned. If you were a Mongol woman, you woke up in the morning and you had to milk all those animals that were in the horde, okay? Another thing that you would do is you would collect dung. You would collect the poo of animals, basically, and you would use that for fire to burn, and camel would burn very clear. So they were following around the camels all day long, trying to get camel droppings and so on. The Chinese women were much different. We know they're very hygienic. If we go to a Chinese restaurant today, usually they wash their hands with a warm cloth. They make you take your shoes off and so on. So it was a very interesting dynamic between Chinese and Mongol people. Now, as far as the decline of the empire, you pretty much know the reasons why empires all fall. And the Mongols, it was no different for them. First off, after Genghis Khan dies, Kublai Khan dies. When Kublai dies, there were 7 weak rulers that followed him, okay? So you had a period of good rulers, and you had a period of bad rulers, okay? This should all sound very familiar from our lessons on empires. Now, The Yangtze River is going to flood at a certain point when the Mongol Empire was kind of on its decline, which meant harvests were bad, which means people were hungry, all right, which means revolutionary groups form and are going to fight back against the Mongols, okay? So there's economic reasons, there's political reasons, and obviously there's social reasons after talking about the differences that we had and so on. And a lot of this stuff we know about from Marco Polo, if you recall, the great Italian explorer that actually did communicate and then make contact and learn a lot about what we know about the Mongols. Now, to finish up, let's talk about what the Mongols left the world, all right? So Mongol influences on the world. So one thing that they're going to do is they're going to improve communication, all right? They will improve communication. They will open up the East. Like I said, Marco Polo traveled and so on. They're going to create trade routes, all right, along the Silk Road, the old ancient Chinese Silk Road, which they used. They communicated frequently. Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan knew what was going on all over the empire because they had great postal routes, all right? They had great postal roads along the Silk Road, along their trade routes, which allowed for them to communicate to the far edges of their empire, okay? So that's one thing that they're going to do. Now, local kings and monarchs in Europe are going to not love this, but they love the idea, people did, that local governments were responsible to the central government, okay? So every part of the empire for the Mongols basically was representative and responsible back to the central government, a little bit in the same way that our government is within federalism and our federal system here. Local governments were responsible to the central government, and great power was given to the emperor. And this is what I meant by the monarchs. The kings and queens of Europe loved the idea that the Khan, the leader of the Mongols, was the person that was in sole charge. And it's going to be somewhat of a very, very totalitarian dictatorship, how these Mongols would rule and so on. So one of my favorite groups in the history of the world, and there's a lot of fun stuff that we can learn about these guys.